Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our online Bible study. I'm Matthew, the lead and teaching pastor here at Mansfield Pentecostal Church, where every Tuesday night we have a thought to think about, a question to ponder, a text to study. Last week, you remember we started our new Bible study series titled The New Creation Story, and we're looking at each of the books, individual books of the New Testament. And you remember that last week we just did a broad introduction into the New Testament. We looked at how the Old Testament fits into the story of the New Testament, and also how it anticipates the coming of the Messiah, and how the letters, the Gospels, or the book of Revelation all explain what Jesus has done and what he's accomplished for us in the new life that he has for us. And so we introduced that last week. Now tonight, what we're going to be doing is that we're going to be doing an introduction into the first four books of the New Testament, which we know as the Gospels. And so we're going to be looking at the Gospels in John, or the Synoptic Gospels of John, I should say, the best news of all. And we're going to be doing an introduction into these books. Now, you may or may not be aware, the word gospel literally means good news. In our English language, gospel has an Anglo-Saxon origin, but is equivalent to the Greek word of evangelion, or from which we get evangelist, and it means the bringing of good news or the bringing of good tidings. In the ancient world, in ancient Greece, messengers would bring a gospel to the inhabitants of where they were people they were living. It could have been a good news that the Greeks had won a military victory, or that there was a bumper harvest. Sometimes when someone brought a gospel or good news, the messenger would receive a reward for the good news. When the Roman Empire, when the Roman Republic turned from being a republic to an empire, and the consul Octavian became the first Roman emperor, Caesar Augustus, a gospel was issued throughout the Roman Empire that there was good news that a monarch had come to power. And so the Gospels in the ancient world were seen as messages of good news, things to celebrate. Today, when we think about good news, we might think about good news that there's been a cure for the disease. Maybe the economy has taken a turn. Maybe you didn't have to pay as much tax as you was thinking you had to pay, or maybe you got the grades that you wanted in your exams. And so we have good news in different ways. Sometimes we send a good news card or congratulation card if someone's got themselves a new job, or a child is in the family. There are many examples of events that warrant what we call good news. However, if you are a follower of Jesus, if you've put your trust in Jesus, you have a piece of news, a piece of good news, as to say, that far eclipses any other piece of good news. And that, of course, is the gospel of Jesus Christ. In fact, the Apostle Paul, when he was writing to the Church of Rome, said that, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." It's the good news, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first for the Jew and then for the Gentile. And so encapsulated in the message of Jesus is a life-transforming power that is better than any psychology hack, better than any scientific breakthrough, better than any pseudo-spiritual experience. This is the gospel of Christ. It's the good news of Christ that has the power to change our lives and to make us into better people. And so this gospel is groundbreaking. It is life-changing. And a bit like in a newspaper today, a bit like you get a newspaper that would publicize instant message of good news, or celebrating good news. So in the Bible, we have what we call four gospels that describe the good news of the coming king, that Christ has come into the world, that a new kingdom is embarking here on planet Earth, and that it's news that needs to be spread out for as many people to hear about this incredible news that has the power to change our lives. Now, before we look into the first four books of the New Testament, we need to ask ourselves, firstly, what sort of literature are the Gospels? What kind of literature are them? Now, it's clear that the Gospel writers will not present to us a biographical account of Jesus' life. Because normally in a biography, you would have a lot of writing about the person's background, their birth, their childhood years, what they did, what they said, who they were. And but what we see here is that when we look at the gospel accounts, we have a little bit about his birth in Luke's gospel and Matthew's gospel. And other than that, we have nothing really about his formative years growing up, except for a few verses, 11 verses in Luke's gospel, when Luke describes Mary and Joseph taking Jesus to the temple as a child. But other than that, there's a huge gap really about Jesus' life. We have nothing about what he did as a carpenter. We have nothing about his interactions with his brothers earlier on in his life. It was a bit of a mystery. It's a bit of an unknown. And the reason for that is that it emphasizes the fact that the Gospels, the message of the Gospels, emphasizes what Jesus came to do on our behalf. And so the information regarding his growing up as a child doesn't really serve that purpose. And so consequently, what we have is not so much 4 biographies of Jesus' life as we do have 4 news bulletins of Jesus' ministry and what he sought to accomplish. Now, obviously, this brings a question. Why do we have 4 Gospels in a New Testament? Why couldn't we just have one Gospel, one written account of Jesus' life, rather than 4? Well, there's a few reasons for that. As you're probably aware, when someone famous was born and then and lived an extraordinary life, and then died, normally more than one biography is written of that person. Sometimes an earlier biography is written about that person that describes what they did, and then maybe later there's another biography that's written to describe what they said, and then eventually another biography might be written to describe who they were as a person. I'm sure there have been countless biographies of Winston Churchill or Abraham Lincoln. And that's generally the pattern when a biography is written about an account of someone's life. However, when it comes to the person of Jesus, we see a pattern of his life that required more than one book to represent his life, okay, or one biography or news bulletin about his life. When we look at Mark's gospel, we see that this is a gospel that describes about what Jesus did. And then when we come to Matthew and Luke's gospel, it describes what he said. When we come to John's gospel, it describes more about who he was as a person. Another reason for the different gospels is also because each of the gospel writers were writing to different audiences. So, for example, Mark and Luke were writing to Gentile audiences, Mark particularly to a Roman audience, whereas Matthew and John were most likely writing to Jewish audiences, particularly Matthew. John was possibly reading to a Jewish audience in a Greek background or to Greek thinkers. So very clearly, with there being different audiences required different gospels, or I should say the gospel's the same as the message, but four different accounts of Jesus' life and ministry for four different types of audiences. As well as that, another reason why we get 4 accounts of Jesus' life is because we get a much more fuller picture of who Jesus was as a person. We get a much more healthy perspective. Imagine for a moment I was to show you an image of a cone. Now, from one perspective, if you look at it from the top, a cone looks like a circle. But if you look at it from the side, it looks like a triangle. However, if you was just looking at a circle or a triangle and you wasn't aware it was a cone, and I said to you both that circle and that triangle are the same object, you say, no, they're not, Matthew, because both shapes would appear to contradict each other. However, because you're looking from 2 different perspectives, what you're seeing is not a contradiction, but you're seeing the same object, but from 2 different perspectives. And in fact, is a cone. And that is what we see in the Gospels of Jesus. What we are seeing is 4 different perspectives of the life of Jesus. And what that does, it gives us a much more fuller picture of what Jesus did, what he said and did, what he did, and what he'd done, and also who he was as a person. In fact, centuries before Jesus came into this world, the prophet Ezekiel had a vision of the glory of God. And in that vision, he saw four faces. There was the face of a lion, the face of an ox, the face of a man, and the face of an eagle. And what's really interesting is that when we look at this vision of Ezekiel and these four faces that Ezekiel saw representing God's glory, we also see four portraits of the face of Jesus in the Gospels. So the face of the ox is represented in Mark's Gospel, which portrays Jesus as a suffering servant. As an ox is a beast of burden that carries the weight. It's a sacrificial animal. Jesus is our sacrifice. The face of the man speaks of the humanity of Christ, which is portrayed in Luke's Gospel. And Luke emphasizes the importance that Jesus is the Son of Man. The face of a lion portrays Jesus as the King, and that is seen in Matthew's Gospel. Matthew emphasizes particularly the importance that Jesus is the King. He is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He is a descendant of David. And the face of the eagle portrays Jesus as from on high, the one who is the Son of God. And we see that particularly in Matthew's Gospel. And so when we look at each of the Gospel writers, they are portraying for us a face of Jesus, a picture of Jesus, and they're giving us a more fuller picture. And although sometimes if you look on the surface, it would seem that some of the Gospel accounts appear to contradict each other, actually, they don't contradict each other. What they're doing is that they're just giving us a more fuller and complete picture of the life of Jesus. So, for example, one gospel writer may write that one man was set free from the demons, and another gospel writer say, no, it was two. Well, they're not contradicting each other. They're just seeing things from a different perspective. And so what we see in the gospel accounts, we see this particularly in the resurrection accounts, we see a difference of perspective of different people's different eyewitness testimony of what they saw when Jesus rose from the dead. So altogether, what we see is that we have four accounts, I should say, of the gospel of Jesus, and they were written both to believers and to non-believers. They provide us an image of what Jesus did, of what he said, and of who he was. He was a suffering servant. He was a son of man. He was the son of God. He was also the king of Israel. And this is why we have four accounts of the life of the ministry and the life of Jesus portrayed in the gospel of Christ in our New Testament. So as we come to the synoptics and to John's gospel particularly, you're going to find there are both similarities and differences. Now, what do I mean by the synoptics? By the synoptics, I'm referring to the first three gospel accounts of Jesus' life, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the reason why they're called synoptics, the word synoptic comes from the word together and optic. Syn means together, optic means to see. So both Matthew, Mark, and Luke are seeing the life of Jesus together from a similar perspective. And what we see is that the first three of what we call the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are portraying Jesus' life with similar content, and they were written at a similar time. Now, the reason for that is because when you read the synoptics very carefully, what you'll notice is of the three, Mark's gospel was clearly written first. And both Matthew and Luke draw from Mark's gospel as a source. As well as that, you also find, and in fact, scholars have found that about 95% of Mark's gospel are also found in both Matthew and in Luke. As well as that, you'll also find that both Luke and Matthew refer to another source other than Mark, which we don't know who that source was, but scholars refer to that source as Quelle. Okay, they use a posh word called Quelle, which is the German for source, meaning that they drew information from another source other than Mark for their Gospels, for Matthew and Luke, as well as drawing from their own experiences. And thus, these are what we call the synoptic Gospels, seeing Jesus together from a similar perspective. And that's why there's a lot of overlap and similarities in these Gospels. Now, in the words of Monty Python, now for something completely different. When we come to the fourth account of Jesus' life, the fourth account of the Gospel of Christ, we have John's gospel. And in John's gospel, what you'll notice, John is relying purely from his own personal first-hand eyewitness testimony, and it's coming from a completely different perspective. It's almost as if you could imagine that the synoptic gospels are looking at Jesus' life from the outside, whereas John's gospel is looking at Jesus' life from the inside. And so as we investigate the gospels, these gospel accounts of Jesus' life, we're going to start with the synoptics. We're going to start with the first 3 books of the New Testament. And the reason we're going to do this, and as we do this, we're going to look at their similarities, how they differ. And we're also going to notice that these Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, occupy about a third of a New Testament. So what they have to say is very substantial in terms of understanding what Jesus did, what he said, and who he was as a person. And so the 4 Gospels of Christ are not just biographical sketches of Jesus' life. They are spirit-inspired portraits that give us a full picture of who Jesus is. That Jesus is our King, as seen in Matthew's Gospel. That Jesus is a suffering servant, as seen in Mark's Gospel. That Jesus is the Son of Man, as seen in Luke's Gospel. That he is the Son of God, as seen as John's Gospel. Each Gospel was written for a specific audience in their context, but yet it remains universally powerful. And it reveals to us, the gospel accounts reveal to us that God has intervened in history to bring salvation to the human race. And for us as believers who take the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, we're not just only to believe the gospels, but we're also to live out the gospel message and share the gospel message. And therefore we become carriers of this amazing gospel message to those around us. And just as the ancient Greek messengers will receive a reward for bringing good news, I believe as believers, we also receive a greater heavenly reward when we bring the gospel message to this most glorious gospel message to those who need Christ as we fulfill the mission of the Lord. So that's our thought to think about tonight, guys. In our life groups, I'd like you to discuss these following questions. The first question is this: which of the 4 portraits of Jesus, the servant in Mark, the King in Matthew, the Son of Man in Luke, the Son of God in John, speaks most deeply to your heart right now, and why? And how does this shape the way you live out your faith? So which of the 4 portraits of Jesus speaks most deeply to your heart right now, and why? And how does this shape the way you live out your faith? And a text of study, I'd like you to read John chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. And as you look at this text, read this text, I'd like you to discuss these questions in your life group, okay? What titles are given to Jesus in this passage? What contrasts are drawn between light and darkness? What does it say about those who receive him? What does it mean that the Word became flesh? How does John describe the mission and identity of Jesus in these verses? Why is Jesus referred to as full of grace and truth? How does understanding Jesus as the Word of God affect your relationship with Scripture? And what would it look like in your life to receive and believe in the Word afresh today? And where is God inviting you to shine his light in the darkness around you? Quite a few questions, I know. Don't have to do all of them. Maybe you can do a few of them as you delve into that passage of Scripture as we introduce the Gospels. Hope you got something out of this tonight. Hey guys, have a great rest of the evening. Looking forward to seeing you over the weekend. God bless you all.